was a chilly October night when Brian found himself driving through a remote stretch of highway. His old pickup was running on empty, and he had hoped to make it to the next town, but the gas gauge stubbornly hovered at E. As luck would have it, he spotted a flickering light in the distance, a lone gas station illuminated by a single, weary neon sign. Brian pulled into the station, which looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The station was old, with a faded awning and rusty pumps. The place had an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. The only sign of life was a flickering overhead light, casting strange shadows across the cracked pavement. He approached the pump, which, despite its age, seemed functional. As he was filling up his tank, he noticed the gas station attendant. The man appeared out of nowhere, wearing a tattered uniform and a cap pulled low over his face. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he was struggling against some unseen force. "Evening?" Brian said, trying to make small talk. The attendant looked up briefly, his eyes hidden in shadow. "Evening?" Brian shrugged off the unease, creeping up his spine, and continued to fill his tank. As he was finishing up, he glanced at the old attendant again, only to find him standing motionless, staring intently at him. There was something unsettling about the man's expression. It was almost as if he was waiting for something. With the tank full, Brian walked over to pay. The attendant was now behind a small, grimy counter, his eyes fixed on a dusty old ledger. Brian noticed the counter was covered in strange artifacts, old photographs, faded newspaper clippings, and an assortment of peculiar trinkets. "How much do I owe you?" Brian asked, trying to ignore the creepy atmosphere. The attendant slowly looked up. "No charge," he said in a gravelly voice. "But be careful out there." Brian gave a confused nod and headed back to his truck. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The gas station's flickering light grew smaller in his rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. A few miles down the road, Brian saw something strange. A car's headlights illuminated a series of discarded objects scattered across the road: old tires, rusted metal, and torn clothing. He felt a chill as he recognized a familiar item, a faded photograph of a family. The family looked eerily similar to the one in a picture on the gas station counter. Brian's unease deepened. He pushed the accelerator, desperate to get as far away from that creepy place as possible. His phone, which had been working fine earlier, now had no signal. The radio crackled with static, and every shadow seemed to move menacingly in the darkness. The next morning, Brian learned that the gas station had been closed for years. No one had seen an attendant there for as long as anyone could remember. Locals spoke of disappearances and ghostly sightings, with the station's name appearing on missing person reports. Brian never stopped at a remote gas station again. The memories of that night haunted him, a constant reminder that some places are better left unexplored. Late one evening, Jenna, a college student, was driving back home after a long study session. She was exhausted and craving the comfort of her bed. As she drove through a desolate stretch of highway, her car's fuel light blinked ominously. She sighed, hoping she'd find a gas station soon. Just as she was about to lose hope, she spotted an old-fashioned gas station in the distance. The sign read, "Joe's Garage," illuminated by a solitary flickering bulb. The place looked abandoned, but had its lights on, and Jenna decided it was worth the risk. Pulling into the station, Jenna noticed the old-fashioned gas pumps, their paint chipped and peeling. The garage itself seemed to be a relic from the past, with a large, rusty door and dusty windows. Jenna approached the only working pump, which seemed to be from another era. She began filling her tank, grateful to have found this place. As she was finishing, Jenna noticed a shadowy figure moving in the garage. It was a man, dressed in old work clothes, his face obscured by a greasy cap. He seemed to be fixing something on a workbench, his movements slow and deliberate. Jenna tried to catch his eye, but he never looked up. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the sound of the gas pump and the occasional clinking of tools. Jenna tried to ignore the creeping feeling in her gut, focusing on finishing up. When she was done, she walked over to the garage, hoping to pay the man. "Excuse me," Jenna called out, but the man did not respond. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Hello. How much do I owe you?" The man finally looked up, his face still shrouded in shadow. He wore a blank expression and gestured vaguely towards an old cash register on a nearby counter. Jenna approached the register, but it seemed empty. She tried to offer some money anyway. The man shook his head slowly. "No need," he said in a whispery voice. "Just be careful." Jenna, puzzled but relieved, thanked him and headed back to her car. As she drove away, she glanced back at the station. The garage door was now wide open, and she saw the man standing in the entrance, staring intently at her. A few miles down the road, Jenna's car began to sputter and slow down. Confused and worried, she pulled over to the side of the road, only to find the tank was empty. How could that be? She had just filled up at the gas station. Frustrated, she walked back towards the station, but it was no longer there. In its place was an overgrown field with broken fences and abandoned vehicles. Jenna's heart raced as she searched for any sign of the gas station, but it was as if it had never existed. She walked back to her car, feeling a chill in the air. Her phone had no signal, and the darkness around her seemed to close in. The sound of distant, eerie laughter echoed through the night. Jenna finally managed to flag down a passing car and got a ride to the nearest town. When she asked about Joe's garage, the locals looked at her with a mix of pity and fear. They told her the place had been abandoned for decades, and there were stories about strange occurrences and phantom sightings. Some claimed that the station was a gateway to another realm, and the attendant was a ghost, trapped in time. Jenna never spoke of her experience again, but she often wondered if she had stumbled upon a place that existed outside of reality, a place where time and space twisted in eerie ways. Late one evening, Tim was driving through a desolate area when his car began to run low on fuel. He spotted a small, dimly lit gas station in the distance. The station, called Miller's Fuel, seemed to be open, but looked abandoned and run down. Tim pulled in and began to fill up his tank. The station's pumps were old and creaky, and the lights flickered intermittently. An elderly woman appeared from inside the station, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She silently watched Tim as he filled his tank. When he finished, Tim walked inside to pay. The station's interior was cluttered with old, dusty items, and the air was thick with an eerie silence. The woman was behind the counter, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she handed Tim a receipt with no amount listed, only a cryptic message. "The pump knows." Tim felt a shiver, but paid no mind to the strange note. He left the station, but as he drove away, he noticed that the fuel gauge on his car was fluctuating wildly. It went from full to empty and back again, with no apparent reason. The car began to sputter and lose power, and Tim had to pull over. As he waited for help, he noticed strange figures moving in the distance, their shapes indistinct, and shifting in the darkness. When help finally arrived, Tim learned that Miller's Fuel had been closed for years. The locals spoke of the station's haunted past, with tales of mysterious occurrences and ghostly apparitions. Tim never returned to that area, but the memory of the mysterious pump and the fluctuating fuel gauge haunted him. It was a chilling reminder of the supernatural forces that lurked in the darkness.
The small town of Cedar Hollow had one gas station, known as Parker's Pit Stop. It was a relic of a bygone era, its faded paint and old-fashioned pumps. The station had been in operation for decades, managed by an elderly man named Mr. Parker. He was known for his gruff demeanor, but had a reputation for being fair and reliable. One evening in late November, a heavy snowfall had begun, blanketing the town in white. The streets were empty, and the gas station was about to close. Mr. Parker was ready to lock up when a battered old sedan pulled into the lot. The driver, a man in his mid-30s, looked haggard and disheveled. He had a sense of urgency about him, and Mr. Parker noticed he had been driving for hours. "Evening," Mr. Parker called out as the man stepped out of the car. "We're about to close, but I can fill you up if you're quick." The man nodded gratefully. "Thanks. I've been on the road for too long." As Mr. Parker pumped the gas, the man began pacing anxiously, glancing around nervously. He seemed to be constantly looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Everything all right?" Mr. Parker asked, trying to make small talk. The man hesitated before answering. "I'm just trying to get away. There's something following me." Mr. Parker frowned. "What do you mean?" The man glanced around again, lowering his voice. "I don't know how to explain it. I keep seeing shadows in my rearview mirror. I thought I was being paranoid, but I don't know. I just need to get somewhere safe." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden, eerie chill that swept through the gas station. Mr. Parker shivered and looked around. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the snow was falling harder now. He tried to shake off the discomfort and finished up with the gas. As the man was paying, he continued to act restless. "I really appreciate that. I just need to get out of here." Mr. Parker handed him the receipt and watched as the man hurried back to his car. The sedan's engine roared to life, and the man sped off into the storm. The snow continued to fall heavily, and Mr. Parker went inside to close up. As he was locking the door, he heard a loud thud from the direction of the gas pump. Curious, he stepped outside and saw a dark figure standing near the pump. The figure was cloaked in shadow, and Mr. Parker couldn't make out any details. "Hello?" Mr. Parker called out, but the figure didn't move or respond. He felt a sense of dread and quickly retreated inside, locking the door behind him. The night dragged on, and Mr. Parker couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his routine tasks. Around midnight, the snowstorm reached its peak, and visibility was almost zero. Then, just before closing time, Mr. Parker received a call from the local sheriff. "Mr. Parker, we've got a situation. There's been a report of a vehicle accident on Route 7. We need to check if you've seen anything unusual." Mr. Parker's heart sank. Route 7 was the road the man had taken. He described the vehicle and the driver to the sheriff, who confirmed it matched the description of the accident. The sheriff asked Mr. Parker to keep an eye out for any additional information. As the storm raged outside, Mr. Parker couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He stayed up, watching the snowfall, and waiting for any updates. The next morning, the sheriff arrived at the station, bringing news that no one had survived the accident. The man in the sedan crashed into a tree, and the car had been found abandoned. Mr. Parker was deeply disturbed by the news. The sheriff mentioned that the man had been seen in the area a few days before, and there had been strange reports of someone or something lurking in the shadows. The sheriff's comments made Mr. Parker think back to that eerie figure he had seen near the gas pump. Over time, strange things began happening at Parker's pit stop. Customers reported seeing shadowy figures in the parking lot and hearing unexplained noises. Some claim to have seen the ghostly image of a man pacing around the pumps, mirroring the behavior of the last customer. Mr. Parker eventually retired, and the gas station was sold to new owners. The new owners faced their own share of unsettling occurrences. The stories about the last customer and the ghostly figure became local legend. Some say that the shadows are still out there, waiting for the next traveler to drive through Cedar Hollow. Samantha was an adventurous soul who loved exploring remote locations. One crisp winter evening, she found herself driving through a desolate region, car's headlights cutting through the darkness. Her fuel gauge was dangerously low, and she hoped to find a gas station before running out. After what seemed like hours, she saw a small, dilapidated gas station in the distance. Its sign, Miller's Stop, was barely visible, and the place looked as if it had been abandoned for years. The pumps were old, with cracked screens and rusted nozzles, but Samantha was relieved to see that the lights were on. As she pulled in, she noticed that the station had a peculiar atmosphere. The air was colder than the surrounding area, and there was an eerie stillness. She parked and began filling up her tank. The only sound was the hiss of the gas pump and the occasional creak of the old building. While she was refueling, Samantha saw a figure moving in the shadows of the station's office. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, with a face hidden behind a thick veil. The woman didn't move or acknowledge Samantha's presence. But Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. Finished with the pump, Samantha walked over to the office to pay. As she approached, the woman behind the counter remained silent and still. Samantha tried to get her attention. "Hello? How much do I owe?" Samantha asked. The woman finally looked up, her eyes dark and hollow. She reached into a drawer and pulled out an old leather-bound ledger. She opened it slowly and traced her finger down a page, but no amount was written. Instead, the ledger was filled with names and dates, many of them crossed out. The woman handed Samantha a faded receipt and said in a whispery voice, "You're lucky to be here." Confused but relieved, Samantha took the receipt and left the station. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the gas station fading into the distance. But as she continued, she felt an unsettling presence, as if she was being followed. The road ahead seemed endless, and her car's headlights flickered intermittently. She pulled over to check her phone, but there was no signal. The only sound was the howling wind and the distant echo of what sounded like a woman's voice. Suddenly, her car's engine sputtered and died. Panicked, Samantha tried to restart it, but it was useless. She stepped out and noticed the gas station was no longer visible, swallowed by the darkness and snowfall. With no other options, she started walking back in the direction she had come from. As she trudged through the snow, she heard footsteps echoing her own. But when she turned around, no one was there. The eerie feeling of being watched grew stronger. After what felt like hours, Samantha saw the dim lights of a house. She approached and knocked on the door, and a kind elderly couple let her in. They offered her warmth and food, and Samantha shared her experience.
The couple's faces grew solemn as they listened. They told her that Miller's Stop had been closed for decades, and many people had reported strange occurrences and ghostly sightings. The place was rumored to be haunted by a woman who had disappeared there years ago, her spirit trapped in the station. Samantha left the couple's home the next morning, shaken by the experience. She never returned to that desolate road, but she often wondered if the echoes of midnight were still out there, waiting for the next traveler to fall into their grasp.
It was a quiet summer night when Mark, a truck driver, pulled into a small rural gas station to refuel. The station, known as Willow's Way, was an old establishment with a worn-out sign and faded paint. Despite its age, the place seemed to be well kept, with neat rows of vintage gas pumps and a quaint little store. Mark was exhausted from his long drive and welcomed the chance to stretch his legs. As he filled up his truck, he noticed the gas station's lone attendant, the young woman with a friendly smile. She was working diligently behind the counter, her presence a stark contrast to the otherwise deserted area. "Evening," Mark said, trying to make conversation. "Evening," the attendant replied cheerfully. "Just finishing up a few things." Mark appreciated her warm demeanor and went inside the store to pay. The interior was filled with old-fashioned knickknacks and snacks, creating a nostalgic atmosphere. The attendant was behind the counter, her movements quick and efficient. "Thanks for stopping by," she said as she rang up the purchase. "Not many folks come through this way." Mark nodded, paying for the gas and grabbing a couple of snacks for the road. He was about to leave when he noticed something odd. The attendant seemed to be fidgeting, glancing nervously towards the back of the store. "Everything okay?" Mark asked. The attendant's smile faltered slightly. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just a little weird tonight." Mark shrugged off the odd behavior and headed back to his truck. As he was about to start the engine, he saw the attendant through the window, standing by the back door with an anxious look on her face. She seemed to be staring into the darkness beyond the station. Curious, Mark decided to investigate. He walked back to the store and tried to open the door, but it was locked. He knocked, but the attendant didn't respond. After a few moments, he noticed her slipping out of the back door and disappearing into the night. Mark's curiosity turned to concern. He waited for a while, but the attendant didn't return. He went inside the store, hoping to find her or get some answers. To his surprise, the store was empty, and everything was eerily quiet. Feeling uneasy, Mark decided to leave. As he drove away, he glanced back at the gas station and saw the attendant standing at the window, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide and filled with a sense of desperation. The next morning, Mark heard disturbing news on the radio. The gas station had been reported as abandoned for years, and there were stories of strange occurrences and mysterious disappearances. Locals spoke of the vanishing attendant, whose image had been captured in old photographs, always with a fearful expression. Mark never forgot that unsettling night. The image of the attendant's desperate face stayed with him, a haunting reminder of the eerie events at Willow's Way. In the middle of a long, deserted highway, there was an old toll booth that had been closed for years. It stood alone, a relic of a time when the road was busy. Travelers often mention the eerie feeling they got when passing by, but it wasn't until Sarah found herself stranded that she experienced it firsthand. Sarah had been driving cross-country when her car broke down on the deserted stretch of highway. The nearest town was miles away, and with no cell signal, she had no choice but to find help. As she walked, she spotted the old toll booth in the distance, its faded sign barely readable. Approaching the booth, Sarah noticed that it was surprisingly well maintained for its age. The windows were clean, and the old cash register inside looked polished. There was a note on the door, written in an elegant script, "Please ring the bell for assistance." Sarah hesitated but rang the bell. After a moment, a middle-aged man in an old-fashioned uniform appeared at the window. His face was obscured by a cap, and his expression was solemn. "Need help?" he asked. Sarah explained her situation, and the man nodded, though he didn't move to assist her immediately. Instead, he simply watched her with a vacant stare. "I'll need to check your car," he said finally, disappearing into the booth. Sarah followed, curious and anxious. Inside, the toll booth was filled with old maps, dusty books, and vintage toll tokens. As she waited, she felt a strange chill in the air. The man reappeared after a few minutes, his expression unchanged. "I'll get someone to help you," said, his voice echoing strangely. Sarah waited for what seemed like an eternity. Minutes dragged on. The silence grew oppressive. She decided to leave and head back to her car. As she stepped outside, she noticed that the toll booth had changed. It looked older, more dilapidated, as though it had aged overnight. The man was nowhere to be seen. The bell on the door was silent, and the atmosphere had turned cold and eerie. Sarah decided to return to her car, but when she tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. She waited and waited, but no help arrived. Eventually, passersby stopped and offered to assist her. They were bewildered to find that the toll booth was now a crumbling ruin, barely recognizable as the same structure Sarah had approached. When Sarah finally got back to town and asked about the toll booth, she was met with strange looks. The locals told her it had been abandoned and falling apart for years, and that there were rumors of a ghostly attendant who appeared to lost travelers but never offered real help. Sarah never drove that stretch of highway again. The memory of the lonely toll booth and its spectral attendant haunted her, a chilling reminder of the unsettling encounter. Tom was a truck driver who had been on the road for over 20 years. He'd seen it all, or so he thought, until one fateful night when he stopped at a gas station off the beaten path. The station, known as Harper's Haven, was a small, isolated stop with an air of neglect. Pumps were old, and the station itself had a dusty, forgotten look. Tom was running low on fuel and needed to top off his tank. As he approached, he noticed that the station was eerily quiet, with no signs of life. The only light came from a flickering bulb above the pumps. He shrugged it off, thinking the place was just closed for the night. As he began to fill up, an elderly man emerged from the shadows. He was dressed in a worn-out uniform and had a weathered face. He didn't say a word as he approached, simply nodding at Tom. Tom returned the nod and continued pumping gas. When he finished, Tom walked inside to pay. The man was behind the counter, his eyes shadowed by a cap. He didn't say much, just handed Tom a crumpled receipt. Tom noticed that the receipt had no price written on it, only a series of strange symbols and numbers. "Is this all?" Tom asked. The man didn't respond. He simply gestured towards the door. Tom left the station feeling uneasy. As he drove away, he glanced at the receipt and tried to make sense of the symbols. They seemed to form a pattern, but Tom couldn't decipher. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just an oddity of an old, forgotten place. Later that night, Tom's truck started experiencing problems. The engine began sputtering and losing power. Pulled over, hoping it was a minor issue, the problems continued. The truck finally came to a halt on the side of the road, and Tom realized he was stranded. He decided to call for a tow, but his phone had no signal. As he waited, he noticed strange lights in the distance, flickering on and off. The lights seemed to move in a peculiar pattern, similar to the symbols on the receipt. Suddenly, the lights disappeared, and the darkness seemed to close in. Tom felt a chill run through him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The night dragged on, and the truck's engine problems persisted. By dawn, a tow truck arrived, and Tom was finally taken to a mechanic. The mechanic examined the truck and found nothing wrong. It started up without issue, leaving Tom bewildered. When Tom asked about Harper's Haven, the mechanic looked at him strangely. "That place hasn't been in operation for years," the mechanic said. "They say it's haunted. Some folks have seen strange things there, like glowing symbols and eerie figures." Tom never went back to Harper's Haven, but the memory of the mysterious receipt and the strange occurrences stayed with him. He often wondered if the receipt had been a warning of the eerie forces that lurked in that forgotten place. Sarah and Jake were on a road trip across the country, eager to explore new places and make memories. One night, as they drove through a remote area, their car started running low on fuel. They spotted an old gas station in the distance, its sign barely visible through the darkness. The station, named Jackson's Fuel, was surrounded by overgrown weeds and looked abandoned. Despite its condition, the gas pumps appeared to be in working order. With no other options, Sarah and Jake decided to stop and refuel. As they got out of the car, they noticed an unsettling silence. The station was deserted, and the air felt unnaturally cold. They approached the pumps, and as Jake began to fill up the tank, Sarah noticed something strange. The gas pumps had a faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound. "You hear that?" Sarah asked, voice tinged with concern. Jake nodded, looking around. "Yeah, it sounds like whispers." The whispers grew louder, and they seemed to be coming from the gas pumps themselves. The words were indistinct, a mix of murmurs and incoherent phrases. Sarah and Jake exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing. As Jake finished refueling, he walked over to the small, rundown store attached to the station. The door creaked as he entered, and the interior was filled with dusty shelves and old, expired product. The store had a musty smell, and the atmosphere was oppressive. Sarah remained outside, trying to ignore the eerie whispers coming from the pumps. She glanced at the station sign. It was partially obscured by the darkness. The name, Jackson's Fuel, seemed to flicker and change as if the letters were moving. Suddenly, Jake emerged from the store, his face pale. "There's no one here," he said, "and the store is empty." As they prepared to leave, Sarah heard a faint, ghostly voice coming from the direction of the pumps. It sounded like it was calling her name. She turned around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew more insistent, and the air around them seemed to grow colder. Sarah and Jake hurried back to their car, but as they were about to drive away, they noticed that the gas station had changed. The pumps were now covered in strange symbols, and the sign had transformed into something unrecognizable. Panicked, they drove away as fast as they could. The whispers seemed to follow them, echoing in their minds. The rest of the journey was filled with an unsettling silence, and neither Sarah nor Jake could shake the feeling that they had left something behind at Jackson's Fuel. When they reached the next town, they asked about the gas station. The locals were baffled. They claimed that Jackson's Fuel had been closed for years, and there were stories of strange occurrences and ghostly whispers drove people away. Sarah and Jake never spoke of their experience again. The memory of the whispering pumps haunted them, a chilling reminder of the otherworldly presence they had encountered. Jake and Emma were on a late-night road trip and decided to stop for a quick bite. They spotted a small, 24-hour diner off the highway, with a drive-through window that seemed to glow warmly in the darkness. The diner, Luna's Eats, looked inviting, and they pulled in, hungry and tired. As they approached the drive-through, the window was illuminated by a soft, flickering light. Jake placed their order, and the voice on the intercom sounded clear and cheerful. They were instructed to wait at the window for their food. The wait was unusually long, and as they sat in the car, they noticed that the diner's sign was flashing erratically. The lights inside flickered, creating a strange, disorienting effect. Emma glanced at the menu board, which seemed to be displaying random, nonsensical items. Finally, a woman appeared at the drive-through window, carrying a bag of food. She smiled warmly, her face partially hidden by the dim light. Jake thanked her and drove away, eager to eat. As they continued down the road, they opened the bag and found that it was empty. Confused and frustrated, they looked back at the diner, but it was no longer there. The area was now an open field, with nothing but darkness stretching out before them. Jake and Emma tried to make sense of what had happened. They turned around and drove back to where they thought the diner had been, but it was as if it had vanished completely. There were no signs of the diner, and the road seemed unfamiliar. They eventually found a gas station and stopped to ask for direction. The attendant, an older man, looked at them with a mixture of pity and concern. "You saw Luna's Eats, didn't you?" "Yeah." Jake and Emma nodded, and the attendant sighed. "That place was closed down years ago. It's said to be haunted. People have reported seeing it appear out of nowhere, only to vanish without a trace." The story of the ghostly drive-thru became a local legend, and Jake and Emma never spoke of their experience again. The memory of the empty food bag and the disappearing diner haunted them, a chilling reminder of their encounter with the supernatural. It was a hot summer day when Greg, a traveling salesman, found himself on a long, empty stretch of highway. His car's air conditioning had failed, and he was desperate for a break. He spotted a rest stop in the distance, a small building with a faded sign reading, "Greenwood Rest Stop." As he pulled in, Greg noticed that the rest stop looked abandoned. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and the building was in disrepair. Despite its condition, the door was slightly ajar, and Greg decided to investigate, hoping to find some relief from the heat. Inside, the rest stop was dusty and filled with old furniture and forgotten supplies. The air was stale, and the place had a musty smell. Greg noticed a small cafe area with a counter, but there was no one around. He walked to the counter and found a rusty old bell. He rang it, hoping to attract attention. After a few moments, a middle-aged woman emerged from a back room. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes and had a vacant look in her eyes. "Hello?" Greg called out. "Can I get something cold to drink?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded and disappeared into the back room. Greg waited, but the silence was unsettling. The only sound was the creaking of the old building and the occasional flutter of a loose paper. After a while, the woman returned with a cold drink. She handed it to Greg without a word and then turned and walked back into the shadow. Greg tried to thank her, but she didn't acknowledge him. As he drank the beverage, he noticed that the rest stop seemed to be growing darker. The sunlight outside was fading, and the temperature inside was dropping rapidly. He glanced around and saw that the building's condition was deteriorating further, as if time was moving backward. Greg decided to leave, but when he reached the door, he found that it was stuck. Panic set in as he struggled to open it. The rest stop was now eerily silent, and the shadows seemed to be closing in on him. The woman's ghostly face appeared at the counter, her eyes filled with a sorrowful expression. She seemed to be trying to say something, but her voice was a faint whisper. Desperate, Greg finally managed to force the door open and stumbled outside. The rest stop was now a crumbling ruin, barely recognizable from the state it had been in earlier. The area around it was completely deserted, and there was no sign of the woman. Greg drove away quickly, heart pounding. He later learned that the Greenwood Rest Stop had been closed and abandoned for years, and there were rumors of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions. The memory of the woman and the decaying rest stop haunted Greg, a chilling reminder of his unsettling encounter. Tom's Station was a small gas station located on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was known for its old-fashioned charm and friendly service. But there was one story that locals whispered about, a story of a haunting that had plagued the station for years. One night, a young couple, Lisa and Mark, found themselves driving through the area. Their car was low on fuel, and they decided to stop at Tom's Station. The place looked as quaint as ever, with its vintage pumps and cozy store. As they filled up their tank, they noticed that the station was unusually quiet. The lights were dim, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. Lisa went inside the store to pay while Mark waited outside. Inside, the store was filled with old memorabilia and dusty shelves. Lisa approached the counter and found an elderly man behind it, wearing a classic gas station uniform. He greeted her with a polite but distant smile. "Good evening," Lisa said. "How much do I owe?" The man looked at her with a vacant expression and handed her a handwritten receipt. Lisa glanced at the receipt and saw that it had no amount listed, only a cryptic message: "Beware the shadows." Lisa felt a shiver run down her spine but dismissed it as a quirky note. She paid for the gas and returned to the car. Mark was already inside, and they drove away, eager to continue their journey. As they drove, they noticed that the night had grown unnaturally dark. The shadows around them seemed to move and shift, and the air felt heavy with an unspoken tension. They tried to shake off their unease, but it lingered. Suddenly, their car's headlights flickered, and they saw a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by a veil. The figure appeared briefly and then vanished into the darkness. Panic set in, and they drove faster, but the shadows seemed to follow them. They finally reached a small motel and decided to stop for the night. As they settled in, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The next morning, Lisa and Mark asked about Tom's station at the motel's front desk. The clerk's face turned pale as she listened to their story. "Tom's station has been closed for years," she said. "There were rumors of strange occurrences and sightings. Some say the place is haunted by a woman who disappeared there long ago." Lisa and Mark never returned to Tom's station, but the memory of the eerie night and the haunting figure stayed with them. The cryptic message on the receipt became a chilling reminder of their unsettling encounter. In a remote area on the outskirts of town, there was a small, family-run gas station known as Ellis's Corner. It had a reputation for being a bit quirky, but it was beloved by locals for its old-world charm. One cold winter night, Rick, a long-haul trucker, pulled into Ellis's Corner to refuel. The station was quiet, and the lights inside were dim. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Ellis, greeted Rick with a warm smile as he began filling up his truck. As Rick waited, he noticed that the station had a peculiar atmosphere. The walls were lined with old photographs and antiques, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound coming from the back room. Curious, Rick asked Mr. Ellis about the humming noise. Mr. Ellis's smile faltered slightly, and he hesitated before answering. "Oh, that's just the old heater," he said, though the noise seemed too rhythmic and mechanical to be from a heater. Rick finished refueling and went inside to pay. The interior was filled with old-fashioned decor, and Mr. Ellis was behind the counter, processing the payment. Rick noticed a strange detail. There were no other customers around, but the place seemed busy, as if people had just left. As Rick was leaving, he saw a woman standing outside the station. She was dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, and she appeared to be waiting for something. Rick waved to her, but she didn't respond. When Rick reached his truck, he noticed the woman walking toward the station. He tried to call out to her, but she disappeared into the building. Rick went back inside to check. The station was empty, and Mr. Ellis was nowhere to be found. Confused, Rick looked around and noticed that the photographs on the walls seemed to be of different people, all with an unsettlingly similar expression, a mix of sadness and resignation. The humming sound grew louder and more insistent. Rick decided to leave and drove away, feeling a growing sense of unease. As he continued down the road, he saw the woman again, standing by the side of the highway. She was now staring directly at him, face pale and expressionless. quickly drove past and didn't stop until he reached a truck stop several miles away. There he asked about Ellis's Corner and was met with blank stares. The locals told him that Ellis's Corner had been closed for years, and there were stories of a phantom customer who appeared at the station, only to vanish without a trace. Rick never went back to Ellis's Corner, but the memory of the phantom customer and the strange humming noise stayed with him. It was a chilling reminder of the ghostly presence he had encountered on that cold winter night. Jake and Lisa were on a cross-country road trip when their car broke down on a remote highway. With no cell service and the nearest town miles away, they spotted a small, isolated gas station in the distance. The station, known as Bennett's Fuel, looked old and run down, had a single light on. They pulled in, hoping to get some fuel and find help. As they approached, they noticed that the station seemed strangely quiet. Pumps were old, with faded labels and rusty handles. The building itself was in disrepair, boarded-up windows and peeling paint. An elderly man emerged from the shadows as they began refueling. He wore a weathered uniform and had a distant, vacant expression. He didn't say much, just nodded in acknowledgement. Jake and Lisa felt a strange chill, but didn't think much of it. Once the tank was full, Jake walked inside to pay. The interior was filled with old equipment and dusty shelves. The man was behind the counter, but there was no cash register, only a strange antique device that looked like an old-fashioned fuel gauge. Jake paid for the gas, and the man handed him a receipt with no total listed, only a cryptic message. "The gauge tells all." Confused, Jake left the store and returned to the car. Lisa was already inside, and they drove away, eager to continue their journey. However, they soon noticed something strange. Their fuel gauge was fluctuating wildly, showing empty one moment and full the next. The car began to sputter and lose power, forcing them to pull over. They were stranded again with no way to contact anyone for help. They tried to make sense of the strange gauge, but it seemed to have a mind of its own, moving between extremes without any logical pattern. As they waited, the night grew darker and colder. They saw strange lights in the distance, moving erratically. The lights seemed to follow them, and they felt an unsettling presence around them. Eventually, a passing motorist stopped to help and towed them to the nearest town. There, they learned that Bennett's Fuel had been closed for years, and there were stories of strange occurrences and ghostly figures associated with the station. Jake and Lisa never returned to that stretch of highway, but the memory of the vanishing fuel gauge and the eerie night stayed with them. It was a chilling reminder of their encounter with the supernatural. The small town of Birchwood had a gas station called Harper's Garage, which had been a staple for decades. It was known for its reliable service and friendly staff. But one fateful night, it became the setting for an unsettling encounter. Emily was a late-night driver who had been on the road for hours. Exhausted and low on fuel, she saw Harper's Garage in the distance. The station was old but well-maintained, and the lights were on, promising a warm welcome. As she pulled in, she noticed that the station seemed unusually quiet. The pumps were functional, and the store appeared to be open. Emily went inside to pay and found the station's owner, an older man named Mr. Harper, behind the counter. "Good evening," Emily said, trying to strike up a conversation. "Pretty quiet here tonight." Mr. Harper smiled faintly and nodded. He handed her a receipt with no amount listed, only the words, "The last call." Emily paid and went back to her car, feeling a strange sense of unease. She started to drive away when she noticed that the gas station's lights began to flicker and dim. The entire area seemed to be shrouded in an eerie, ghostly glow. As she continued down the road, Emily noticed that her car's fuel gauge was rapidly dropping, even though she had just filled up. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the darkness around her grew thicker. Suddenly, Emily's car stalled, and she was stranded on the side of the road. She tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The headlights illuminated a figure in the distance. It was Mr. Harper, standing by the side of the road, his face obscured by shadows. Emily's heart raced as she tried to get out of the car, but the figure vanished before her eyes. Panicked, she tried to flag down passing cars, but none stopped. The darkness seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped significantly. Eventually, a highway patrol officer arrived and helped Emily get her car started. The officer mentioned that Harper's garage had been closed for years, and that there were stories about strange occurrences and ghostly figures. Emily never returned to Harper's garage, but the memory of the eerie night and the cryptic receipt haunted her. It was a chilling reminder of her encounter with the supernatural and the ominous warning she had received.